and together a day after an apparent Russian strike on a hospital in Kyiv. Speaking as he left for Washington, Sir Keir Starmer described it as an appalling attack.
It's all about standing together with our allies, discussing practically how we provide further support for Ukraine and send a very, very clear message to Putin that we will stand against Russian aggression wherever it is in the world.
He'll be hosted by US President Joe Biden for his first summit as Prime Minister. Junior doctors in England say they have no plans to call further strikes following a meeting with the new Health Secretary. The British Medical Association's described talks with Wes Streeting as positive. A drink driver who killed a baby and his aunt has been jailed for 17 years. Daryl Anderson took a photo of his speedometer hitting 141 miles per hour moments before the crash near Durham in May. England boss Gareth Southgate says his team has a chance to make history tomorrow on the eve of their Euro 2024 semi-final with the Netherlands. He says his players can reach a first final on foreign soil. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 53 points at 81.39. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.18. LBC weather, persistent rain for northern Scotland and Northern Ireland tonight. Showers elsewhere and a low of 9 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 1 minute past 8 on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. It's Tuesday's Cross Question. Let me introduce you to my panel. To my left is Justine Greening, former Education Secretary. She's the founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. Next to her is Paul Nowak, the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress. Was it Trades Union? I never know which to...
TUC.
TUC, yeah. Actually, good answer, because he doesn't even know the answer, right?
Trades it is.
No. And to my right, Rachael Maskell is Labour MP for York Central. And next to her, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, Conservative peer, former chair of the British Joint Intelligence Committee and also former Security Minister. They're waiting for your calls on 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to Mark in Coventry. Mark, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening, everyone. After watching the swearing-in of MPs today, does the panel agree with me at the time that Parliament was reformed? For example, maybe having seats for him.
It's a terrible line, Mark, but I got the gist of your question, which I will now repeat. After the swearing-in of MPs today, is it high time for Parliament to be reformed? I think Mark was going to go on to tell us how he thinks it should be reformed. If we can get him back on a better line, I'll come back to him when we've heard from our panellists. Rachel, as the current sitting MP here, do you have strong views on this?
Well, I think we should constantly look at reform of our parliamentary democracy and our systems. So absolutely there is. I mean, we saw today those pictures. Labour MPs can't even get into the House, let alone have a seat. So obviously how we do Parliament is going to be very different in this term. But what's really important is that we're able to represent our constituents, take their concerns forward. And we need lots of platforms to be able to do that. There's only 2 debating chambers in Parliament. And of course, there will be a longer queue for questions as well when we want to scrutinise the government of our day, which thankfully is the Labour government, but also to ensure that we're raising the concerns our constituents bring to us.
There's still the same number of MPs, isn't it?
Well, there is, but the balance...
You could argue that the government won't be scrutinised as much because there are too many government MPs.
Well, the balance is very different in this Parliament. Obviously, the size of the majority on the Labour benches, I say with a smile, but what's really important is that we're still going to have issues we want to raise. There's still going to be things that we want our government to do, and to press into that space we need to be able to voice them. So of course we're going to have to find the platforms to be able to be effective at being representatives.
Let me give you one example of where maybe there could be a reform in the appointment of ministers, because we've had this evening the list of junior ministers come out, and I think there are several on that list who are brand new MPs, and I'm not sure it does new MPs a favour to be appointed a minister straight away when there are perfectly good people like you who served your time who could have been chosen instead. And I mean, I'm not going to ask you if you're a bit bitter and resentful towards them, but there will be people who think, well, hang on a minute, we've done all of the hard yards in opposition. Why aren't we getting a chance?
Yeah, I think we need to look at who is appointed as a minister, and I'm quite interested in looking at the people's track records and, you know, who really knows their subject area as well, because if you come in fresh to a brief that you don't know about and then you suddenly got responsibility to lead the country in that area, are you really going to be able to provide the best service? I haven't yet seen the list of junior ministers, so it'll be interesting to see who's been appointed there. But I do think I quite like a bit of democracy as well, so perhaps maybe the House should have a say in some of this.
Oh,
it would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
Madness. What do you mean? Confirmation committees like they do in America. Justine Greening, thinking back to when you were first elected in 2005, was it 2010? 2005. And you were seen as sort of the bright new thing of your generation of MPs, weren't you? Did you feel a lot of pressure on you to sort of live up to those expectations?
Yeah, I remember it was just like a baptism of fire. It's the first result that came out where the Conservatives won a seat that night. And
you know, I was sitting, at my count, on a bench in a sports centre with there was another candidate who was dressed as a clown, and I had this little portable television that I was watching, and he was sort of standing over me with his arm around my shoulder, and the Eastern Daily Press had that picture, just as your result was announced, of Iain Dale being consoled by a clown.
Well, I went on to discover that the nation's press get hold of your mobile and then simultaneously try and contact you. So it was completely overwhelming. And I think I had only been to Parliament about 3 or 4 times. You know, when I did the equivalent of turning up on the Monday, I hadn't had much sleep, and people wanted to film me going in. They wanted to film me, follow me around. And I just thought, look, I don't even know what I'm doing. And you're plunged into this just Kafkaesque world where, especially if you win a seat, you don't have a team. And I remember, you know, finally being given an office after multiple weeks of just working on a desk, all this post and emails just flooding in, with no team, and you're expected to recruit your team when you yourself don't know what you're really doing because you're learning, you know, the trade, as it were. So it's really, really tough. But I coming back to Mark's question, I think there are some really positive reforms that you could make to Parliament, in my view, having been a backbencher in opposition and in government, Iain. And I think one of them would be the balance between government business and non-government business time. So at the moment, we have this little bit of Parliament on Fridays, which is private members' bills. These are often really important bills that make a difference. You have to have cross-party agreement for them. They're not actually allowed to spend any money, and they can be vetoed by one MP or a government whip. And I remember trying to bring one forward on creditworthiness, and it would have meant that if you were paying your rent every month regularly, that could count just like a mortgage payment would. And it was just vetoed, I think, by Chris Chope.
Mm-hmm. It's always Chris Chope.
And it's always, but so this is my point. Those are the bits that should be reformed.
He survived the carnage last Thursday.
Those are the bits that should be reformed, and we should have more opportunities for MPs to work across party in Parliament on bills that they all agree with and get them through. Maybe with some limits on spending, there should be actually an ability to invest in projects that Parliament and parliamentarians want. I think it's, for me, they'd be relatively small but actually quite impactful changes that would mean individual MPs, whether or not they were in government, could actually get laws passed. So there's all that. I think the select committee system works very well, but I would like to see almost like an OBR, but for every department. I think for ministers, as I was, that like to follow the evidence on policy rather than just do the politics, I think that would be really helpful. To have someone like Sir Kevin Collins, for example, in my case in education, saying, well, actually, there's a huge amount of evidence base for why this education secretary is doing this. So I think, there are some actually quite interesting reforms. Here's my final one.
Cool.
My final one would be in the House of Lords. I think if you were appointing somebody into a ministerial role and they get ennobled to do it, but then they don't do it for very long, I don't think they should stay a Lord. I don't think you should get a lifetime peerage for doing a role that may last just literally a few months. That, to me,
who could you possibly be thinking of?
No, it's not just David Cameron, who I have a huge amount of respect for. You know, and there will be numerous examples coming up.
I've got another example.
But I think I'm just saying it's those sorts of things that the outside public just think, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel right.
Yeah. I was talking about this on the final episode with Jackie Smith of the For the Many podcast, because, of course, she's just been appointed as Higher Education and Further Education Minister and has been made a peer. And she was saying exactly what you've just said. She's citing the example of Digby Jones, who got a peerage under Gordon Brown and then after a few months decided he didn't really like the job and then just decided he to walk out. And, of course, he's got a peerage for life. Pauline, you served for 2 years in David Cameron's shadow cabinet. Then you served as security minister in his government. You're a member of the House of Lords. You've presumably got a few ideas of what you would like to see reformed.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I want to say something about what Justine just said about legislation. I think there's too much legislation, for one thing. But I also think it is not well enough considered. And one of the things that we do complain about in the Lords, and I think with justification, is that we get very poorly drafted, very poorly debated legislation from the Commons that does more and more politics and less law. And unless you're going to have a chamber like ours, which is there to really for law revision, you're not going to get, the kind of quality of legislation that we have come to expect. And I think even we find it difficult now to pass really good law, because there's just too much of it. Too big bills,
Well, there are 800 of you. You should sort of share it out a bit.
Yeah, look, there are several different categories, aren't there? And there are a lot of people who only come when the topic for which they've been appointed, like a member of the Royal Society of Scientists, they turn up for those subjects and they make a real contribution. We get better legislation as a result of them being there and more imaginative solutions than if they were not. So there are some real positives of the system we've got. I don't argue that it's anomalous to have an appointed chamber. The Canadians do too. We're not the only democracy that does it. And if we change it completely, one of the things the Commons is going to find, of course, is it gets real competition. Will it like it? It bangs on about how it is we should actually reform the laws and we shouldn't have all these appointed people. But they're inviting, of course, tremendous competition from a second elected chamber, which will have equal validity. It'll be from the regions or something like that. I don't know. And we're all in favour of devolution, are we not? So I think you need to think through the business of how you want to change the second chamber.
Paul.
Yeah, well, I'm not a parliamentarian, so maybe just... No, I'm not a parliamentarian ever. I'm not diplomatic enough. Maybe just put two ideas on the table. I mean, one, Parliament is a workplace, and all too often our unions have real concerns about the way that staff, for example, complaints about bullying and harassment are dealt with and how seriously staff concerns are dealt with. So I'd like to see Parliament just being a better workplace, not just for the MPs, but for the people who provide the support in Parliament. I do think, and Labour have talked about this, it's time to clamp down on most second jobs. Not those second jobs that, for example, those who are doctors and who want to keep their qualifications up. For most of the public out there who cast their vote on Thursday, they expect their MP to be doing that job on a full-time basis, and I think that's a reasonable expectation. So I'd quite like to see those sorts of reforms brought forward. I do have to say, though, I think the public have got a limited sort of... if you think about the real priorities that the government faces right at the moment, is reform of the way we do democracy. I think it's important, but it's probably not right at the top of the public's set of priorities. But, I think there are some simple things you could do that could make a positive difference.
I think on the second jobs thing, I think in the general public there'd be a lot of sympathy for that, but it's where you draw the line. David Lammy had a second job at LBC for quite a long time, and I think he got a bit of criticism within the Labour Party for that. But, talking on the media is part of what politicians do. Now, he happened to be paid for it, just like any other presenter, and quite right too. But is that something that should be banned? I'm not sure it should be.
Do you never want to have a businessman in the Commons? It seems to me you will find that there are certain categories of people who simply won't come into public life No, if the penalty is they have to give up.
There isn't, with all due respect, Pauline, there isn't a shortage of businessmen going into Parliament. There's a shortage of shop workers
but if you say
and
they've then got to give
others.
up their business,
but you
as
know,
a price of
just
it, did
where
you
do you
find
draw the line? Just to give an example, and I'm not wearing a hair shirt here, but I have a for the
very nice shirt.
I'm representing the TUC. I've sat on external bodies. Happy to do that. I think it's important I do sit on external bodies, but I don't take payment for it. So I think there are ways that you can retain your experience without necessarily having to take the income that comes with it.
Rachel, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was an NHS professional before coming into Parliament, and I gave that up because it's a full-time job being a MP, and I just don't know how anybody has the capacity to do the job of being an MP properly and represent their constituents and really serve them and do the work to support them and to hold down a second job. I just think you'll be conflicted the whole time. If you want to be an MP, then you make that commitment. If you want another job, well, go off and do your other job. I don't think people need to hold down two jobs.
Well, I remember in 2005 when I stood in the same election as Justine, and I actually had a sort of pledge card, and one of the pledges was I will not have a second job for exactly those reasons. And I got so much hassle from other candidates saying, I can't believe you've done this because I will have to have a second job. And I'm saying, well, you're fine. You make your decision, I'll make mine. At the 2010 election, I got candidates asking me for how I'd worded it because they wanted to do it too. So, but this was it's a long time ago, that. And so it'd be interesting to see if Labour do actually follow through on that. Right, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Actually, I said I was going to come back to you, didn't you? What was your idea for parliamentary reform?
Yeah, thanks for your answers. I was thinking more practically, really, things like having enough seats for MPs, better citizen, blind MP, no swearing in religious books, pledging allegiance to the country, not the king, not voting in corridors anymore. It's all very archaic, and I think we, the people outside London, are quite detached. I would follow the example of Henry VI in the 1400s and move Parliament to Coventry. Be a great place.
Oh dear, said no one ever. Well, you're right, it is the centre of England, but then again you have to take account of Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, I suppose. Well, you see, that would be... OK, if Parliament wasn't in London, one word answer, where would you have Parliament? Pauline?
Yorkshire.
In York, and it's one of the 4 places Parliament can sit.
Is it?
Yes.
How come?
So there's certain rights which have been laid down.
It says the MP for York Central.
So being at home would be very nice, yes.
And it is a beautiful place. Justine?
I'm going with Sheffield, obviously. Agree on Yorkshire. I'm going to go for South Yorkshire because it is genuinely central. And when I was a small girl growing up in Rotherham, I couldn't understand why Sheffield wasn't the capital because I used to get a ruler out and I was like, look, it's halfway down and it's halfway across and there's Sheffield. So I'm going for Sheffield.
Paul?
St George's Hall in Liverpool. It's a beautiful building. It's purpose built for it. I mean, so if they're looking for somewhere, even on a temporary basis while they refurbish Parliament, St George's Hall gets my vote.
I'd say Norwich. But anyway, what does my opinion matter? Right, Mark, thank you for that. We'll take more questions in just a moment. It's 8:17.
This is LBC.
Summer's out.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Have you done the living
19 minutes past 8. We were just talking about my new book, but we'll stop doing that now. 19 minutes past 8. We have with us on the panel Rachael Maskell, Labour MP for York Central, site of the future British Parliament. Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, Conservative peer. Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC. And Justine Greening, former Education Secretary. Right, a text question from Tom in Manchester. Do you think Europe will become an issue of contention in this Parliament? Or, alternatively worded, is the Pope Catholic? Now, a new poll commissioned by the Pro-EU European Movement campaign has found more than 70% of Labour voters want the party to drop its Brexit red lines, which includes membership of the single market or customs union and the return of freedom of movement. Paul, do you think that Brexit, Europe, is going to become an issue of contention in this Parliament?
You said it, Ian. I mean, Europe is always a source of contention. Do I think it's going to become the defining political issue of this Parliament in the way that it was from some recently previous Parliaments? No, I don't. But we have got, for example, the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement next year. I think there'll be some sensible reforms and changes to that agreement. You know, we've got, for example, Musicians Union would dearly love for us to have more sensible regulations around touring musicians. Another creative
Hasn't
performers.
that been partially sorted?
Yeah, but not fully resolved. Certainly for some of the smaller artists.
It's each individual country.
Yeah,
you have to come
absolutely.
to an agreement.
Yeah. And the costs stack up for smaller artists. So I think there are sensible things that could be done. But again, I don't sense a huge public appetite to put Europe front and centre in terms of the political debate at the moment.
Justine?
I think it will at some stage be back on the agenda in the sense that we need a measured debate about that relationship with Europe. And I think there are two aspects to it. One is clearly the economic perspective. And I think, there is this planned negotiation on how you can take where we're at now and make it better. And I think that's clearly a time when we can look in the round at what's going on. But from my perspective, I think what we've learned over the last, 8 years since we had the vote is that actually a lot of Britain's problems are homegrown. And part of it might have been around the relationship with the EU, but much, much more of, I think, what people are frustrated on about how Britain works is nothing to do with the EU. And that's why I put so much of my time into improving access to opportunity, because for me, the reason Take Back Control really resonated with people in places like where Rachael represents now and where I grew up is because I think people feel like they're not getting a fair crack of the whip. Yeah. And that is to do with how Britain runs, much more than our relationship with Europe. And so for me, the real focus of this Parliament, obviously Boris talked about levelling up. For Labour, it's going to be breaking down barriers. But I think, in a sense, politics is grappling with this same agenda about how do you connect people up to opportunity more fairly. I think the better you can do that, then probably the more political bandwidth you've got to have a sensible debate about the fact that we are always going to be an island off the mainland of Europe, and actually having a measured, sensible, functioning relationship with our European neighbours is sensible. But I don't think, Ian, it means we'll be going back in or going back into some of these institutions. I think it's much more a debate about how we can take some of those areas that just feel like they're not working, and particularly for small businesses and people who export goods. I think trying to find a route through cutting the bureaucracy down. I mean, people complained about EU red tape, but I mean, it's nothing compared to some of the post-EU red tape. So I think there's really practical issues that we need to fix. But most of all, it's coming back to our homegrown problems.
And just on the levelling up agenda, which you've been at the centre of with your social mobility pledge, what do you make of the fact that Angela Rayner has announced today that she's abolishing the Department of Levelling Up and it's now going back to DCLG, I think, Department of Communities and Local Government? Does that send out the wrong signal?
I don't think it does. I think the problem was that we were using this phrase, as you know, levelling up at the DFE. But for us, it was an articulation of a strategy around closing gaps in education. The problem for Boris Johnson was he took the rhetoric for the whole of his government, but then didn't have a plan. So it actually did end up just being rhetoric. So the big issue is almost what's the policy agenda that is going to close those gaps that open up right the way from education, and can Keir Starmer's government with these missions, and the fifth one's breaking down barriers, which is quite right, can he really manage to bring those departments together at a national, regional and local level to actually do the practical stuff? And one of the issues is almost what I would call, in my mind, this last mile politics. So Westminster and Whitehall loves to have these grand strategies, but actually it's how it lands in really different communities that matters. And so I think it's the practicalities of policy that matter much, much more than what you actually call a department.
Rachael, back to Europe.
Well, I think what we'll see is a pragmatism coming in now. Obviously, the renegotiation of the agreement is going to be an important part of that, removing those trade barriers, but also ensuring that we've got that grown-up relationship again with many of the leading countries. If we think about the global threats we're facing, we have got to stick together in the West and to move those relationships forward with our friends and neighbours. And of course, that's going to be a really important piece as we look at global security, as we look at the climate challenges that we're facing. So working with people who are with the same perspective on our globe is really important. Look what's happening at the moment and has happened, with Ukraine. The fact that we're working together with our European counterparts is a really important piece of that, because we're looking at energy and where our energy is sourced from into the future. And the UK can lead much of that agenda because we have got the science, we've got the research, we've got the opportunities there, and we've got to take those opportunities. And certainly that's the ambition of this government, isn't to be a follower, but a leader, not just across Britain, but to take that beyond these shores.
But given the makeup of the Parliamentary Labour Party, I think I'm right in saying that there's not been a single of the 412 MPs identified who voted for Brexit. So let's assume that the majority of those would like to have some sort of much closer relationship with the EU. Given the size of the majority, do you not think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer to change his policy and maybe look at some sort of single market alignment, if not membership?
Well, the reality is we can't just storm our way back into Europe in the way we stormed ourselves up. We've got to start building bridges, and that's kind of the day one job. And let's see where they take us to and where the country moves to as well. If we think about the younger people in our country, we're very clear that they wanted to remain within the European Union. And of course, they increasingly will have a larger political voice over that generation will, and it's about their futures too. So we've got to work together as a country. But I think Justine's right, the divisions in our country have got to be healed and got to be addressed. And a lot of that is born in the inequality that is facing our country, borne out, as we see in the north, significant levels of poverty and deprivation, which leads into wider pieces of inequality, whether about people's opportunities in life. Therefore, part of how we solve that is devolving more from Westminster to those locally elected councils and mayors and so on, so that we can make decisions closer to the people, but addressing the fundamental issues around poverty, lack of housing and educational inequality.
Pauline.
Well, I hear from what's just been said, an agenda which has other priorities, and not really, how far we go on Europe. My own feeling is that actually the Prime Minister will be fairly cautious. He's got a big agenda at home. I think that some of the things that were mentioned earlier on, the being able to take your animal more easily, which is very unpopular at the moment, it's costly and sad. Having greater mobility for students. They're not coming to England to learn English anymore. They're going to Ireland because it's easier and cheaper. And those are real losses for us, both in terms of influence and friendship, and just generally our position. So I think there are quite a lot of little things. Musicians are another, and small business. One of the issues, however, is, one hears on the other side of the channel, that there's some hope and expectation that things will get better and easier with the UK. When it comes, actually, though, to changing, how the single market runs and how they use it, partly as and I'm a pro-European, but they use it as a protectionist barrier, I shall be quite surprised and pleased if they really do start taking away some of the red tape that has been put in place, because it's undoubtedly increased since we left, and it's all part of the game. And it is hard for our small business, actually, to export into Europe, and a lot of them have given up. And there are real losses there. Our trade with France has gone down a great deal. Interestingly enough, it's gone up with the Dutch. That's for all sorts of reasons, including the fact the Dutch are much easier to deal with.
You wouldn't want to stereotype.
I think the fact that the Keir Starmer's got a working majority of 170 actually puts him in a good position to have those negotiations with our European sort of neighbours as well. If it would have been a less clear result, if it wouldn't have been a majority government, I think on the other side of the channel people would have been saying, are we going to be dealing with the same person, the same government in 5 years' time? Now there's an expectation when you're dealing with the UK, you're probably, hopefully, dealing with a Labour government for 2 terms. And, we've talked about things like musicians, getting things like, supply chains in the automotive industry right is important as well. Lots of goods go backwards and forwards, and just making that
and the Germans agree.
It works to the advantage of Europe and our own domestic industries as well.
Yeah. Could I just say one thing about this issue? I think the real moment will come as and when there's any opportunity for Ukraine to join. Why? Because if you look at the construction, the structure of Ukraine's economy, the CAP, among other things, cannot survive in its present form, and there will have to be quite a big change in the institutional structures of the EU and the way the budget is run. And that's a moment at which a lot more rethinking about the types of membership, because I suspect that Ukraine will end up being sort of outer member, and that's where we might find our place. So I think that's a
on
future.
that bombshell.
Yeah.
but there is a logic to that. I completely see that.
Yeah, that's a 10-year agenda, I reckon.
Now, before we go to the news, this amused me. Jerry has said, Ian, it's just occurred to me that cross-question is actually question time light, and that you're actually a frustrated Fiona Bruce wannabe. Given your flip-flopping about being an LBC presenter or an MP, why don't you apply to the BBC to be question time presenter? You'd be reasonably good at it, says Jerry. Wasn't aware.
Very good.
I wasn't aware there was a
Maybe
vacancy.
they should do guest presenters on Question Time.
I'll tell you what, the day the BBC ever employ me will be a cold day in hell for them. Right, we'll take more of your questions in a moment. It's 8:30 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Sir Keir Starmer's set off for Washington for his first NATO summit, saying he has a very, very clear message for Vladimir Putin. The new Prime Minister says the meeting's an opportunity to stand together a day after an apparent Russian strike on a hospital in Kyiv. The long process of swearing in 643 MPs has been getting underway this evening. The Commons has been sitting following the election with Sir Lindsay Hoyle re-elected as Speaker. Heathrow Airport has been granted a High Court injunction against potential environmental protesters on the site. The order preventing demonstrators from trespassing lasts for 5 years and will be reviewed every 12 months. LBC weather: persistent rain for northern Scotland and Northern Ireland tonight, showers elsewhere and a low of 9 degrees.
LBC.
Imagine
Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:33 on LBC. Rachael Maskell is here, Labour MP for York Central, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, Conservative peer, Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC, and Justine Greening, former Education Secretary, founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. Our next caller is David in Brighton. Hi, David.
Hi, thanks very much. Good evening. My question is to do with the upcoming Tory leadership campaign, which in a sense has been going on for quite a while, as all are aware, and I'm genuinely intrigued as to whether some of the candidates, who I won't name, perhaps the more right-wing ones, believe what they're saying, i.e. everything in the country is due to immigration or whatever, or whether they believe it or whether they're simply talking to the grassroots Tories in the context of the election process for the Tory, because some of the stuff coming out is fairly extraordinary, and if they're going to compete with reform, as we heard from Nigel Farage, potholes are down to immigrants. And also, one of the candidates suggested we arrest everyone who smells. So I'm just intrigued as to what the panel thinks, as to whether people really believe it or think they're simply talking to the grassroots who will be responsible for sorting out the final two. Suella Braverman, when she was in power, that was part of a paper that Cleverman, to his credit, got rid of. They were going to arrest rough sleepers who smelled, I think. But anyhow, that's a small bit. It's more whether people really believe what they're saying as a solution for our country.
David,
or whether
you need to continue listening after 9, because we're going to be talking about Suella Braverman and her comments at a conference in Washington last night on, shall we say, just cultural issues, which I've had a bit to say about today. Right, Conservative leadership contest. Do the candidates actually believe what they're saying? Well, I think the only two that have actually said anything so far are Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick. But there are obviously going to be many more candidates than that. Justine?
I think it's interesting, because I think Suella Braverman probably does. Robert Jenrick's clearly been on a political journey, hasn't he? Let's face it. So the Robert Jenrick I remember in Parliament wasn't in that space, as it were, politically on immigration to where he is now. I think it's symptomatic of a party that's just headed off down a political cul-de-sac and has tried to out-reform, out-Farage, Nigel Farage, and it's failed. I mean, it's an experiment that has literally, completely and utterly failed. And so I think for any of the candidates to now say, let's do more of that, just makes no sense to me. It's a bit like one of those, automatic garden mowers that's reached a wall, Ian, and it keeps on bumping up against it, not realising that it needs to head in a completely different direction. And what the Conservative Party, I think, obviously needs to do is head into the mainstream, rebuild its credibility, start to work out how it can come across as competent on policy, and come up with a much more credible offer around this breaking down barriers agenda, I think, that Labour is now rightly picking up and running with, because that's what the country needs. And I don't think we should have a long leadership contest for the Conservative Party. I think it's been having an internal argument with itself for years. I think activists have been out on the street for 6 weeks solid, knocking on doors. I think if it can't, after all that, make a call about the direction it now needs to go in, having listened and seen what the public think, which is that it's been a resounding, you need to spend a lot of time in opposition, I sort of feel like you've got everything you need to know if you're in the Conservative Party to now make a call, and the country will need a functioning opposition. And I think the sooner we can get on with the obvious path forward, which is to head back into the mainstream, the better for not only the party but most importantly Britain.
To which the social media response to you, as you well know, will be, oh, well, you're just a Lib Dem, go and join the Lib Dems, you're not a proper Conservative, because that's what I've had all day, having criticised Suella Braverman.
Well, I wrote an article in The Guardian before Suella made this.
Guilty as charged.
Well, it's not got a paywall, so actually it's something that everybody can read, irrespective of their means, and that's why I think it's important to write articles in The Guardian. But this is before Suella Braverman jetted off to the States. I think most of her constituents would have thought she would have headed into Parliament to make a speech first, rather than going to the US. And, I was calling her out long before she did that, but I think she's been politically inept. I mean, fancy writing an article against your own party in a national newspaper just 48 hours before a national poll. And this comes on the back of her spending months, years, basically bigging up reform, and then, funnily enough, being very surprised and disappointed when reform does better in the election than she wanted it to. I just think we really do have to call time on this political madness and now get back on track and head into the mainstream and play our role in British politics. And I think it's going to be a very fragmented opposition benches, but I also think for the parties that are there, they're going to be quite focused on particular issues. So I think there will be some good opposition, but it's not going to be good for the Conservative Party if they're seen as somehow sat on the sidelines whilst everyone else is getting on with it.
Well, after her speech in Washington, I got a text from, should we say, a fairly senior Conservative MP who said her speech can be summed up as, I couldn't run my department or work with my colleagues, so I should be leader. Fairly damning.
And of course, they, stepping into the shoes of Liz Truss, which, if alarm bells don't ring on that strategy, I don't know. There's a basic sort of politics 101 here, isn't there, that's not being passed?
Rachael.
Well, the country has just given the government and this chaos a huge message to say that we don't want that. We actually want you to address our issues. And yet here we have Suella Braverman going over, as you say, copying what Liz Truss did, which ended in disaster, but disaster for the people of our country.
Well, she's actually copying what Jeremy Corbyn did, isn't she?
Well, I would say not. I would say absolutely not. I would say Jeremy Corbyn was putting together a coalition in order to try and address the issues of poverty, inequality.
The coalition of the hard left.
Well, it was much broader than that. And what I would say, what we have got here is somebody that is pushing us to the far right. I'm not sure anyone's going to be following her because people want their issues resolved. They've waited and waited and waited for that opportunity to have the NHS fixed, to go and get a home, a roof over their head. In the case of my constituents, they're struggling out there. And here we've got somebody grandstanding on an international stage. It's not what the country needs. It's not what the people want. And her time has come to go.
Paul?
Well, if I look beyond my sort of allowing myself a little bit brief feeling of schadenfreude, actually two issues. One is political. There is clearly a gulf between what it is going to take to win the leadership of the Conservative Party and what it would take to win an election, and the two things are very, very different. Suella Braverman's sort of brand of politics, I think, is toxic, but it has a real-world impact as well. I mean, it's not just politics. It has an impact on trans people. It has an impact on people of colour in this country, because what you're doing is legitimising those culture wars, legitimise demonising groups and individuals, and I just think it's a really nasty, divisive politics. And just as we need a sensible, grown-up conversation on Europe, we need a sensible, grown-up conversation on migration, on gender recognition. All of these issues, which at the end of the day are about real people, get reduced to political sound bites, and frankly, somebody is on the hurting end, the receiving end of that sort of nasty sort of politics. And as I say, I think the public have cast their verdict clearly. Justine said this, I think, sort of absolutely perfectly. You can't out Farage. But I don't think that Suella or indeed Robert Jenrick or probably any of the other leading contenders are going to learn that lesson.
Well, it's interesting that Suella Braverman's main supporter has been Sir John Hayes, who likes to see himself as a bit of an operator in leadership contests, and he's just declared that he'll support Robert Jenrick. So I'm not sure her campaign is going to get anywhere, but we will soon see. Let's introduce a follow-up text question from Jack in Hessel before I come to Pauline. Is the Conservative Party capable of rallying behind a new leader, or will they suffer a similar fate to Labour in the 80s and 90s and experience a long period of ideological infighting? Pauline?
There is a danger of that, I think. I'm in Justine's camp, so you're not going to get, in a sense, a different desirable way forward. I take it that the electorate is going to be the party, and the party in the country will be, all those who have signed up as Conservatives will actually do the vote between the final two. And I find it very hard to know exactly, where sentiment exactly in the party membership actually lies. I don't know whether you have confidence in being able to to have a view on what that is, but I certainly
I think a lot of
rely on them not going quite far right.
I think a lot of conservative activists were absolutely dismayed by the Suella Braverman article just literally 48 hours before the election. They thought it was extremely disloyal, which it was.
Certainly.
And I also think that the penny has dropped for many activists that the Reform Party is another political party, just like Labour, just like the Lib Dems, that will run candidates against the Conservative Party, and therefore it's just part of that political competition. But so it should not be put in a sort of separate quasi-friend camp, when actually, this is just part of the political discourse. They have a different perspective on a number of issues. And I think really the challenge for the Suella Bravermans of the world is genuinely, legitimately, if she thinks that's actually the right way to go, just join the Reform Party. I mean, Lee Anderson did that. The second time he's changed party, but he ran as an MP. He's now elected as a Reform MP. That's a choice. But in a sense, what you can't do is stay in one party.
No, I'm just confident than you. I think that the party. The party membership will actually make the right what I would regard as being the right choice, which is
only time will tell, won't it?
First time round. If you look at what happened to us after when Tony Blair took over, we went through several leaders actually before we landed one that had longevity.
They did actually vote for David Cameron. They also voted for Liz Truss, but I think there's a lot of buyer's remorse there among Conservative Party members because they have only themselves to blame.
One of the things I would hope is that we'll actually learn from our mistakes. Let's hope so. I mean, and let's hope that you're right, particularly about wrong footing by Suella. I mean, that was a very silly thing to have done.
Well, as I say, you can, if you want to have your say on Suella Braverman and particularly what she said in the speech last night, we'll tell you about that after 9 o'clock and take your calls. More questions to come in just a moment. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:47. Rachael, Maskell, Pauline Neville-Jones, Paul Nowak and Justine Greening with me taking your calls and texts. Wesley in Gravesend says, do we have a NIMBY problem in our country? Paul?
I think If you took the example of HS2, for example, I mean, part of the reason why HS2 had some massive cost overruns is because rather than sort of facing down some of the opposition, in particular those Tory shires, the government decided they're going to build tunnels through the bulk of the route. And so quite often people don't like major pieces of infrastructure going through their back gardens, and I understand why. But we do as a country have to think, if we're serious about getting to net zero, if we're serious about reindustrialising our country, then we are going to have to invest in large-scale infrastructure. And I think actually the decision by Labour to allow onshore wind was the right decision, a brave decision, but the right decision. And they announced today the National Wealth Fund, and I hope that National Wealth Fund will power more large-scale infrastructure because this country desperately needs it. HS2, sort of that was a decision taken at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester last year behind closed doors. But no one can argue who's been on the West Coast main line that has got any serious assessment of the amount of freight that goes on that line as well, that we needed high-speed rail in this country, and probably not just HS2. Unfortunately, that horse has bolted.
Pauline?
Well, do we have a problem? Yes, I think so. But I think most countries have a problem. I don't think this is unique to us. People not liking whatever the development is in their area. But there's no doubt that it's damaging. And I think our planning system, does answer for quite a lot. Because apart from anything else, it doesn't come to resolutions. It's not as if after months and months and months you actually get an answer and you then get action. And that's one of the reasons why we don't build houses. So I think there is a problem there. However, I'm not very happy about what has already been announced about quotas being set, and you will bloody well build houses, whatever you think.
I'm delighted by that. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, because the reason there were only 90,000 housing starts last year, and coincidentally that was the year that Michael Gove abolished all the targets for local authorities. So
I don't agree with abolishing targets, no, and I do believe in reforming the planning system. I'm not sure I really believe in being told, and you're going to do it whatever.
Rachael?
Well, I think we absolutely have to do it whatever, because people haven't got a home, and if we are going to address one of the biggest drivers of inequality, that is housing. But we can't just say we build more. We've got to manage the stock that we've got. And across the country, we've got around 1 million homes which aren't inhabited. So in my constituency, I've got over 2,000 short-term holiday lets, Airbnbs. That's taking away family homes from other people. So reforming the whole housing system to address the inequalities which have grown is really important. And many people who have the label stuck on them as being NIMBYs have got children and grandchildren that absolutely want to have a home. So we've got to address the inequality issues to ensure that there is fairness across the system, and that is certainly not the case at the moment. So saying that we've got to have numbers on housing will get these things built, which is the most important thing, but also enable us to build the skills agenda, because to build those homes, we're going to have to grow the labour force with the right skills to be able to take that forward. And we need to do that, whether it's around building communities, whether it's building major infrastructure, or indeed the businesses of the future as well.
Justine?
I think it's really tough, and I think part of it comes down to, it is definitely down to planning, which is incredibly adversarial and almost sets up communities against developers and vice versa. And it's almost a negotiation where the developer goes in with a higher ask than they think they're going to get, and it kind of gets everybody off on the wrong foot. And you can only look down the road from me at the All England Tennis Club in Wimbledon, where they've proposed a really big expansion that is way too big actually for that space. Had they done something more proportionate, I think probably local residents would have been much more behind it and actually gone along with it.
What do they want to do?
They want to just put tons and tons and tons of extra courts and buildings on what is currently parkland. But you can contrast that with the Thames Tunnel, where actually I had big bits of my constituency being dug up, but by contrast, that organisation worked with us really closely. I had residents meetings for literally 10 years with them as they developed their plans, worked with us. They looked at the legacy that we would get out of it. Nothing was almost too much trouble for them to take on board our concerns. They got to the bottom on every single one of them, a significantly better project, and one that people understood was about our environment and our River Thames.
It hasn't happened.
It's getting open, but in a sense, what we were going to have was this huge sort of amounts of digging in the constituency, down by the river, lots of, trucks, and, it was a big construction site. King George's Park in Wandsworth's been getting dug up for quite a while, a big bit of it.
I've never heard of it.
No, it's the super sewer that's running underneath.
Oh, so it's not a road?
Tideway.
The Thames Tideway, yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, sorry.
I thought you meant it was a road.
I said I meant the Thames
Tunnel,
Tideway.
I thought, excellent.
No, so the Thames Tideway tunnel.
Right.
So I think there are examples of infrastructure where you can get it right, and on high speed too. I mean, the problem was it's a massive project that you needed to have a compensation package for people affected by it to allow them to get on with their lives. And I spent so much time debating with Treasury about how to get a package that was suitably... It wasn't about being generous. It was about dealing with people who were suddenly affected by this project, dealing with them fairly, so that they had some choices to be able to get on with their lives. And I think it's there where the projects go wrong, where we don't deal with people who are being affected fairly, and it's all of those sorts of things.
It's not incomprehensible they didn't start in the north.
We've got time for one more question. I'm going to ask you all to be very brief on this. Looking at the clock, we've only got about 45 seconds each, but I'm going to give Pauline a little bit longer because it's up her street, this question. Greg's in Bangor. As Keir Starmer heads to America to meet with Joe Biden at the NATO summit, can Labour really rely on Biden as an ally worth having? Pauline, former security
He's the ally
minister.
we've got. He's the ally we've got. So you rely on him. And what's more, for as long as he remains the president, we are his best good friend and a loyal ally. No argument about that. And that's the only way that responsible governments behave. So my view, we should just shouldn't have any views on that subject. I think it's an issue of real contention, and it's quite worrying to see that the pressure on Biden's growing. I think we may well be heading for a too late change of candidate.
He seems very adamant, doesn't he?
I know, but he does seem very. But I think digging grave.
Not quite at that stage yet.
No, but you can see digging hole into which in the end not able to sustain his position, and I think that's the worrying possibility.
Okay.
And he took a whole week. He took a whole week to produce a sort of counter policy and organise himself to go on the air. And we'll see how well he does. But boy, we should shut up. It's not our business.
Rachael?
I just think there's really important decisions that have got to be taken this week, and of course we've got the leaders we've got, and what's really important I think is Keir Starmer is going over a freshly elected Prime Minister with clear ambition, and I think it's our responsibility to take that leadership as we go into this summit, to put sense on the table, to talk about the instability and the challenges in our world, and to come out with the outcomes that we desperately need to bring that stability.
He's got to have a really worthwhile message on our defence in that case, and how much money we're going to spend. This business of not actually being willing to put a date on increasing defence expenditure, it doesn't carry a lot of clout.
But now we're in government, we have to make decisions. So,
but you're going to take a year over it.
Well, there are lots of things that we also need to look at. The state of the economy we've been left, which is also a massive challenge. But what we have to do is to ensure that we are addressing the longer term solutions of how we are going to stabilise so much of this planet Earth, which at the moment is clearly needing the de-escalation of the risks that we're seeing, and that's the most important thing that we can see.
Paul? I mean, what's the counterpoint? I mean, could you rely on Donald Trump? And I think if you're dealing with some of the those big issues, whether it's dealing with Putin, dealing with climate change, I'm not sure that I'd have any faith in the other candidate. I mean, the one thing I would say to you, Iain, is I've got no intention of running the TUC when I'm in my late 70s, early 80s. Frankly, why you'd want to run the free world?
I've got intention of still being here.
You only do a couple of hours a day, though.
That from the head of the TUC, honestly.
Take up with your NUJ rep.
Don't have one. Actually, I used to be a member of the NUJ about 30 years ago. But anyway, Justine.
So I think in the end, it's about a relationship with America, the US as a country as a whole, isn't it? It's not just about Biden. I'm absolutely sure you can.
You need to behave towards the head of it. I mean,
yes, I was about to say, Pauline, I think you can rely on Biden. I think there's no question about that as his role as president. I think the big question is obviously what comes next. But whatever does come next, in a sense, it doesn't change what Britain needs to do, which is to forge the strongest possible partnership with the US and to make sure that it's part of a broader partnership in Europe that can help us stand up to what's going on in Ukraine, because that is literally in our backyard. And making sure that the US are part of that alliance, in a sense, is, I think, on so many different levels, absolutely crucial.
OK. Right, our fun question from Georgia in Manchester. Singer Gareth Gates has said he was inspired to try acting by meeting Rowan Atkinson because the Blackadder and Mr Bean star also has a stammer which he manages to overcome. Who off the TV inspires you in life and why? Justine.
Oh, God. I was sort of thinking about this. The one character that just came to my mind, I don't know whether it's inspiring me in life, but I just thought was incredibly powerful, was Sergeant Catherine Cawood in Happy Valley. I just thought that was absolutely an amazing character on TV, and just the spectrum of emotions that she went through as a character, what she dealt with, how she responded to it. I think she was actually pretty inspirational as a character. It was incredible.
No idea who you're talking about.
I'm not even going to... Everyone else who's listening to this watched Happy Valley and probably loved it.
Well, having said I don't believe in second jobs, I do have a sideline as a very unsuccessful singer-songwriter. And so I'm not inspired, but I do worry that I'm turning into sort of David Brent from The Office, with the guitar in the corner of the room, and saying I'm not only the General Secretary and more so a chilled-out entertainer.
Bring it in next time.
I'll bring my ukulele in if you want.
Are you serious? Have you got one?
Yeah.
Can you play it?
Well, as much as anyone can play the ukulele,
You can do a George Formby, can you?
Yeah, when I'm cleaning windows.
Right, did you request?
Next time, bring it in.
That's a whole hour's worth.
No, it really isn't. Pauline.
I'm pathetically, I didn't get anywhere. I don't watch television very much, so...
no one inspires you at all?
I just couldn't think of anybody.
You've had 10 minutes to prepare this answer.
I know.
That's the best you can come up with. Right, we're going to give your time to Rachael.
Well, I'm going to take you out of your agony because I'm in the same place. But but it is people that inspire me, and I think people like Greta Thunberg, who, as a girl who sat outside her parliament believing in something and daring to do it, and then look, she changed the world and the world's perspective on climate change. That's the type of person that inspires me.
I wish I hadn't said David Brent now.
See,
it's much more worthy.
From Rowan Atkinson to Greta Thunberg, honestly. Right, tomorrow's panel includes the Conservative Shadow Cabinet Minister Andrew Griffith, former Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond, Jennifer Ewing, who's from Republicans Overseas UK, and the former Labour political strategist John McTernan. That's tomorrow night from 8. Thank you very much to all four of you for joining us tonight. In the next hour, we are going to return to the subject of Suella Braverman's speech to the National Conservatives Conference in Washington, D.C., where she said that the pride flag was monstrous. She had a right old go at transgender people. And you think, well, it's only, 4 or 5 days after the general election. Why was she making the speech in Washington? If she wants to become leader of the Conservative Party, maybe she should be saying these things here. Well, actually, I don't think she should be saying these things at all. I've got into a lot of trouble on social media today for calling her speech disgusting. People saying I should bugger off to the Liberal Democrats because I'm clearly not a proper Conservative. What is a proper Conservative, and how can the Conservatives win back power if they want to become a sect rather than a political party?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Sir Keir Starmer's travelling to Washington for a NATO summit with world leaders. President Biden will host the Prime Minister